mucho tiempo, es 1 hora y media, así que tienen tiempo de sobra para hacer preguntas. Y bueno, me parece, ¿cuántos jugaron al Loom de acá? Listo, ya está. Me parece que no hace falta hablar mucho más sobre el juego. Recuerdo que tenía, creo que 12 años cuando lo jugué por primera vez. Ya era fanático de las aventuras entonces. Y es una época muy linda porque recuerdo que el tema de charla en el colegio, cosa que hoy es totalmente... No se escucha más. El tema de charla era, por ejemplo, ¿pasaste la puerta blindada en el Maniac Mansion? O ¿por qué pruebabas del Monkey Island? Era todo un furor con las aventuras. Pero cuando jugamos al Loom por primera vez, yo recuerdo lo diferente que era y lo mucho que representó para muchos jugadores el cambio de cómo pensamos en videojuegos y lo que son capaces de hacer. Era realmente una obra de arte, literaria. Y recuerdo que tenía una mezcla de, cuando terminé, una mezcla de emoción y felicidad por el lado terminado, pero también un poco de amargura, porque ya sabía entonces que no iba a jugar ningún juego como ese. Y creo que ya pasaron 20 o más de 20 años y todavía no he jugado un juego como el Loom. Así que cuando estemos listos, vamos a dar inicio. ¿Cómo está pasando? ¡Woo! ¡Más sorteos! Sí, si la logística no falla, tenemos realmente un momento espectacular luego, así que no se vayan. Ya que los tenemos ahí, si no lo escucharon, la fiesta de la EVA es el sábado en Million, un lugar que está muy cerquita de acá. Sí, pueden ingresar con la cintita, gratis. ¿Cuántos jugaron a The Dig? Menos. Tenemos una data interesante. Yo durante muchos años estaba creído que The Dig había sido un fracaso comercial para LucasArts. Es en realidad el juego que mejor vendió, nos comentó Brian, lo cual fue una revelación. Si se animan a preguntar algo sobre ese juego, si tienen alguna inquietud, anímense.
Tengo una pregunta. Acá.
Sí. ¿Vos? ¿Dónde?
No, acá del otro lado.
Ah, hola.
Sí, ¿qué tal, Andrés?
Hola, Andrés, ¿cómo andás?
Sí, mañana para entrar a la fiesta hay que ir con la cinta.
Sí.
Si me baño y si me despega.
Ay, no sé, yo siempre me lo preguntan. No se saquen la cinta, si se borra algo o la pierden, los reacreditamos. Pero nos darían una mano si no la pierden.
O sea, no se bañan.
No, yo les pido de corazón y báñense, porque si están como estoy yo, van a tener que bañarse. On your mark. Yes, of course. Bueno. ¿Cuántos jugaron juegos de Infocom acá? Infocom. No. No. Bueno. Van a querer prepararse para, si todo sale bien, el año que viene va a estar muy interesante para juegos de Infocom. Solo eso les puedo decir. Son aventuras legendarias de texto puro y podríamos decir que son la fundación de todo lo que se está haciendo ahora. O sea, en términos de diseño, muchos conceptos que hay en videojuegos hoy en día fueron incorporados por primera vez con las aventuras de texto. Donde no había gráficos, eran la pantalla y su imaginación. Bueno, y ahora, si estamos listos... El suspenso nos está matando a todos. ¿Vamos? Un aplauso muy fuerte para Brian Moriarty, por favor.
Can you bring up the sound? Good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of EVA 15 by inviting me to Argentina in this strange, beautiful, and so far very friendly city. Please be courteous and silence all cell phones, smartwatches, Tamagotchis, and other sound-producing devices. The presentation you're about to see was delivered a few months ago at the 2015 Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. Present among the several hundred attendees at that speech were many of my longtime peers in the digital game industry. I was especially honored by the presence of nearly a dozen of my former colleagues from Lucasfilm Games, including Ron Gilbert, the designer of The Secret of Monkey Island. Bear this in mind as you watch and listen. Warning, this lecture is a total spoiler for Loom. If you haven't played the game yet and think you might want to someday, you probably want to leave now.
Hi. So, tell me about Loom.
You mean the latest masterpiece of fantasy storytelling from Lucasfilm's Brian Moriarty? Why, it's an extraordinary adventure with an interface of magic. Stunning, high-resolution 3D landscapes, sophisticated score and musical effects, not to mention the detailed animation and special effects, elegant point-and-click control of characters, objects and magic spells. Beat the rush! Go out and buy Loom today!
Not tonight, Mother Hetchel.
Especially tonight. Draw the curtains, boy. Sit here by the fire. Now, tell me, how many threads are there in a draft?
4.
Their names?
The throw.
That's 1.
The beat.
2.
The treadle and the rest.
Good. Let's see if you remember the draft I taught you. Spin it for me. Pitiful. Listen to me.
I guess I'll never learn to weave.
Rubbish.
But where do I begin?
You begin with this. Do you know what it is?
No.
This is called a distaff. Our ancestors used a distaff to spin flax into thread. We use it to spin music and light into threads of influence.
Show me.
Hold the distaff in your hands. Now, spin that draft I taught you again.
It's glowing.
It's telling you when your pitch is correct.
What happens if I spin all 4?
Let's find out, shall we? Let me shut this first. All right, listen carefully. I want you to spin those 4 threads again. As you spin the last thread, point the distaff at the ball of yarn inside my knitting basket.
But you just closed it.
Indeed. Those 4 threads form a pattern of opening. You're going to lift up the top of that basket without even touching it. Spin. Concentrate. Now, point. Not at the window.
My Lucasfilm adventure begins here. Here, in April of 1988. This wall calendar from my collection shows me leaving Boston for San Francisco on Saturday the 9th. My destination was a private residence in the hills overlooking San Jose, the home of world-famous game designer Chris Crawford, who I had befriended a few years earlier. Chris had invited a few dozen other people from the game industry to meet and chat in his living room. This informal event, the first of what we now call the Game Developers Conference, was scheduled for April 11th, the Monday immediately following the 13th annual West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco. Chris gave a lecture at the fair on Sunday the 10th, which I attended. I arrived at the lecture hall a few minutes late, and it was packed. Every seat was taken, except for one right down in the middle of the very front row. So that's where I sat down, next to a stranger who became the person responsible for my Lucasfilm adventure, Noah Falstein. I took this classic photo at the second Game Developers Conference in Milpitas later that year. Now, Noah, who currently serves as the head of game design at Google, was and is a gregarious fellow. After Chris's lecture, he glanced at my name badge and then introduced himself as a designer for Lucasfilm Games. Now, I'd never heard of Noah, but I had certainly heard of Lucasfilm, and he had heard of me from my work at Infocom. After chatting for a few minutes, Noah mentioned that Lucasfilm was looking to hire another game designer, and he asked me if I would be interested in working here. So imagine the fun of having the authority to ask that question. Things at Infocom were not going very well right then. The company had been bought by Activision 2 years earlier and was chafing under management demands for more games with fewer resources. Text adventures were being strangled by the rise of graphic adventures coming from companies like Sierra Online and, yes, also Lucasfilm. In fact, my boss had refused to subsidize my trip to California. I was there on my own dime, and I was grumpy about it. Noah and I traded business cards, and I began working at Skywalker Ranch on August 11th. The daily gourmet lunches are served here at the main house. The interior of this building is fairly spectacular. For instance, the passenger compartment of the central elevator is carved from a single piece of redwood. The games group, then consisting of about 20 people, had its offices here in the simulated rusticity of the stable house. This is my mugshot from the 1988 company yearbook, and that's my business card on simulated rustic cardstock, embossed with the Lucasfilm logo. Notice no email address in those days, no URLs, no hashtags, just a phone number. The telex number on the bottom of the card was used by banks to wire money to George. This was my first office, which I shared with Noah. They gave me a Macintosh for writing, a DOS PC for game development, and a terminal for accessing the company network. On the PC monitor, you can see a background from Loom open in Deluxe Paint 2, a consumer product sold by Electronic Arts that was our main tool for creating art in those days. And here are a few of my colleagues. There's Noah again on the right. Two of the names here are of particular interest. The Scumlords, Ron Gilbert and Eric Wolmunder, who together created and maintained the development system used to build most of the classic Lucasfilm adventure games, including the one I was about to make. I'll talk a lot more about that system in just a few minutes. One of the fun things about working at Skywalker Ranch was the decor. It's filled with original concept art and props from Lucasfilm movies. Soon after I arrived, the games group borrowed one of these props, the Holy Grail from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for a photo shoot. Between shots, I borrow the Grail for a cup of coffee. Now you know the secret of radical weight loss. These are the only known copies of the original design documents and source code for Loom. 800K Macintosh floppies, which employ a proprietary format readable only by vintage Macintosh disk drives. In preparing for this lecture, I obtained a dusty old Mac, which had not been turned on since the mid-90s. After reseating all the cables and the boards, I got it to boot and determined that the files on these disks were still intact. A few moments later, after making this happy discovery, but before I could actually retrieve any files, the hard drive on the Mac crashed and permanently died. When I gave this lecture in San Francisco, I did not know if these documents would ever be seen again. However, thanks to the help of a colleague at WPI, nearly all of the files have been successfully recovered, including the original concept document, which bears the date August 18th, 1988, less than 3 weeks after I started working at the ranch. Now, my previous games for Infocom were all fantasies, and Lucasfilm hadn't published anything in that genre yet since Labyrinth in 1986, so I decided to make my new game a fantasy. The offices in the stable house where we worked were full of computer magazines like Byte, PC World, and various Unix journals. One afternoon, I was leafing through one of these magazines while mulling ideas for my new fantasy game. In one magazine, which I have not been able to identify yet, I came across an advertisement for what I think was a math coprocessing card or maybe a transputer. It showed a sexy photograph of an expensive-looking circuit board covered with IC chips, something like this, but not this exact one. The copy under the photograph referred to that circuit board as a Loom. Loom. Let's strip this now classic game logo of its historic trappings. We'll start by shooing away those pesky purple swans. We'll lose the twinkling stars. And for a few precious moments, let us liberate the word from Disney's lawyers. In modern English, loom is a word with many meanings. As a noun, it refers to a frame used to weave planes of thread into cloth. As a verb, it means to appear as a strange, impressive, or frighteningly large form, or to take shape as an impending occurrence, as something big about to happen. It shares the sound of other English words with dark, secretive meanings: womb, tomb, doom and gloom. Seeing this word applied to that circuit board touched something in me, something deep, something that was ready. In that moment, the age of the great guilds and the tragedy of the Guild of Weavers was realized, complete, and whole. It was finished. I spent the rest of the afternoon just writing it all down. Some people call this sort of thing creativity, as if something was being created from nothing. But I've come to believe that such moments are really a kind of premonition, a memory from the future, an intuitive perception of imminence, a grace. The world unlocked by that word, loom, was vast and ancient. Introducing it to players adequately was going to be a problem. At first, I thought of including an illustrated storybook in the package, as I've always done with my Lucasfilm or my Infocom games, such as this one, Wishbringer. But then I remembered this large brick building nestled in a hillside on the other side of the ranch. This was Sprocket Systems, now known as Skywalker Sound. Then and now, it houses the most advanced and luxurious post-production facilities in the world, including the ultimate THX screening room, the incomparable Stag Theater. You have not seen or heard a movie until you have experienced it in this room. Standing there in that playground of technology, I realized that I now had the means to achieve an old dream and bring the world and characters of a game vividly to life in sound. These two guys helped me do it. John Rieger was a freelance director of radio drama for National Public Radio. He was recommended to me by my Sprocket Systems consultant, Randy Tom, who has been nominated for 14 Academy Awards in sound design and editing, and walked home with 2 of them. The Loom audio drama was written in parallel with the game design and recorded in March of 1989 with a superb cast of British voice actors, including several BBC veterans. Unlike current industry practice, our cast performed all of their scenes together as an ensemble, using indoor and outdoor locations selected for their natural ambience. These digital field recordings were then transferred to 16-track analog for editing and mixing. Now, about that game design. When this lecture was first given at GDC last March, the program book described Loom as, and I quote here, the first game to embody what would become the LucasArts philosophy, that players should never have to deal with dead ends, accidental deaths, or forced restarts. On investigation, this claim turns out not to be true. Here is page 8 of the Commodore 64 manual for Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders, published in 1988. A version of those paragraphs appeared in the manuals of all subsequent Lucasfilm adventures, including Loom, 2 years later. Now, this philosophy was a response to the sudden death syndrome infecting many adventure games at the time, particularly those from Lucasfilm's chief rival, Sierra. It also contains a jab at the parser-based adventures being offered by certain other game companies. It's true that Zach, and also its predecessor, Maniac Mansion, avoided killing the player without fair warning. But both games, together with many others, including some of my own, were guilty of equally egregious design choices, such as the inclusion of annoying mazes, the exaggerated separation of items needed to characterize and complete puzzles, and other methods of artificially increasing the time needed to complete the story. Now, this was done to satisfy hardcore gamers, who, perhaps not unreasonably, expected games with a 1990 retail price of $40, about $72 today, to provide at least a dozen or more hours of gameplay. But for better or worse, Loom had a different agenda, influenced in particular by 2 people. Mike Dornbrook was the head of marketing at Infocom. He guided the team responsible for some of our industry's most memorable advertising and collectible packaging. He was also the keeper of the mailing list, the names and addresses of tens of thousands of Infocom customers who had sent in registration cards or ordered merchandise from the mail-order store. Now, Mikey, as we knew him, was fond of conducting surveys with his mailing list. One survey contained several questions, among them these 2. What are your favorite Infocom games? And which Infocom games have you actually completed? One evening, over too many Mai Tais, Mike explained to me the results of this survey. He found a strong correlation between the games people said that they liked and the small handful of games people said they had actually finished. It's worth noting here that my best-selling Infocom title, Wishbringer, was an easy fantasy aimed at children and beginners, and that the idea for that game also came from Mike. The other influence on my agenda for Loom was Amanda Goodenough, a woman who, with no prior programming experience, in 1987 created a little storybook on her Macintosh using HyperCard. Inigo Gets Out had no explicit affordance signals, no words, no instructions. None were necessary. You just clicked on the pictures to move forward. Predictably, gamers had no interest in Inigo Gets Out, dismissing it as a toy for children and beginners. Nevertheless, we might do well to remember that children and beginners greatly outnumber gamers. And children and beginners were delighted by Inigo. Chris Crawford championed Amanda's innovation to anyone who would listen. And a few years later, Robin and Rand Miller used the same technology and the same desperately simple game mechanic to create the biggest-selling PC game of the 1990s, Myst. In addition to the game design philosophy paragraph from Zach McCracken, the instruction manual for Loom included this statement written by me. Loom is unlike traditional adventure games in many ways. Its simple mysteries are designed to engage your imagination and draw you deeper into the story, not to frustrate you or increase the amount of time it takes to finish. You can never be stranded while playing Loom. If you're not sure how to proceed, remember, the knowledge you need to continue the story is always available somewhere nearby. Most important of all, Loom is designed to be completed. We spent a lot of time and effort creating these discs. We want you to enjoy them all. Designed to be completed. So by now, some of you are probably wondering how I got away with this. So where does Moriarty get off ignoring the Lucas fan base, right? Well, that would be a totally legitimate question at an ordinary game company where the mandates are to stay in business and make money, preferably lots of it. But after Star Wars, Lucasfilm was never an ordinary company. This was made very clear to me in my first job interview with Steve Arnold, the head of the games division. With a totally straight face, Steve told me that Lucasfilm Games had two mandates. 1, don't lose money, and 2, don't embarrass George. These are the words that drew me away from Infocom, which was dying precisely because it has lost its freedom to experiment. Now, when I started designing Loom, I had every reason to expect that it would look and play pretty much like its predecessors, Maniac and Zack. It would be built with the same engine. Now, I must admit that coming from Infocom with its DEC System 20 mainframes and offices full of MIT geniuses, I was a bit apprehensive about this thing they called scum. But when I opened the hood, I was very pleasantly surprised. In every respect, Scum was just as good a tool for making graphic adventures as Zill was for making text adventures. Like the Z system, Scum compiled to bytecode, squeezing impressive functionality into very little memory. It was also multitasking, which made the choreography of animation and cutscenes surprisingly easy. And then I discovered the best part. The architects of Scum had done something very, very smart. Only a few assumptions about the user interface were hardwired into the engine. Practically everything on the screen was controlled at the scripting level. My experiments were just beginning. Here's something I could not show at GDC last March, a fragment of the now recovered source code for Loom. This is the Scum script for the game's opening cutscene. Excuse me a moment. Now, the previous Scum games had employed what was essentially a menu system. in which the player constructed imperative commands from a selection of verbs and nouns. But the characters in the game never do what you're doing. They're waiting for you to tell them what to do. The connection between the player and the character is somewhat abstract. From the beginning, I wanted Loom to offer a closer connection. To whatever extent possible, I wanted the player and Bobbin to perform magic together. My first idea was to implement what would now be called a gestural interface. The player would draw previously learned shapes on the screen to invoke magic spells, with Bobbin imitating your motion as you drew. Maybe not a bad idea, maybe even a little ahead of its time, but there was a problem. Our principal market at the time was PC compatibles running DOS, and many customers with DOS machines did not yet have a mouse. Loom had to be playable with the keyboard alone, and you really don't want to make players perform gestures on a keyboard. But another kind of performance works very well on a keyboard: music. The user interface of Loom has only 3 affordances: walking, touching, and spell weaving. This scene from the beginning of the game is a good place to demonstrate them. Now, the elders of Bobbin's village are flying away after being mysteriously turned into swans, except for his caretaker, Hetchel, who has been turned into a swan's egg. Bobbin is left alone in the sanctuary of the Great Loom, with Hetchel's egg and a distaff dropped by the chief elder. Hovering over an active object shows its icon. Clicking on the object moves Bobbin over to it. Clicking on the icon touches the object, which produces a variety of effects. The distaff is special. When you touch it, Bobbin picks it up and it becomes a more or less permanent part of the user interface. Otherwise, the game has no physical inventory. Many objects emit musical notes when you touch them. These 4-note sequences, called drafts, these are the verbs of Loom. They can be applied to any touched object by repeating the note sequence on the distaff. Bobbin's performance is synchronized with yours. You play together. Up to this point in my career, all of my published games had been designed, written, and coded pretty much by myself. Loom forced me to learn a new skill, the most important and difficult skill of all: how to work with others. Luckily, 2 of Lucasfilm's most skilled, mature, and patient artists were assigned to my project. Gary Winnick was the first artist hired by Lucasfilm Games. He had provided the background, characters, and animation for nearly every title published since 1984, and had also co-designed Maniac Mansion with Ron Gilbert. Gary served as Loom's head character animator and lead designer, creating hundreds of stands, walks, sits, swims, gestures, and falls for the main character, Bobbin, who I am quite sure he wishes never, ever to animate again. Mark Ferrari was a fantasy illustrator and a master of the colored pencil. He'd been contracted by Gary to do backgrounds for Zach McCracken, despite having no experience with computers whatsoever. When Loom was released in 1990, it was hailed as one of the most beautiful computer games ever created, due almost entirely to Mark's particular combination of fine taste, artistic skill, and technical curiosity. To appreciate the magnitude of Mark's achievement, you need to understand the technical constraints under which he was forced to work. The consumer PCs of the late 1980s displayed color graphics at a resolution of 320 by 200 pixels. The white box up there in the upper right left corner compares this to the resolution of a modern 2K display. To make matters worse, the pixels were not square. They were tall rectangles shaped like the gold box you see here. 2 color modes were available. Older and cheaper machines had CGA graphics with a fixed palette of just 4 colors: black, white, bright cyan, and loud magenta. Later machines supported EGA graphics with 16 fixed colors: black and white, 2 shades of gray, and 2 shades of each of the primary and secondary colors. The dark yellow was tweaked a bit, yielding a murky, intestinal shade of brown. Typical results were not what you would call subtle. Mark said it was like looking through the eyes of a circus clown on pupil dilators. But it got the job done, and because it was so simple, it compressed very well, which was very important at a time when graphics shipped on floppy disks. However, while working on Zack, Mark began to experiment with a technique called dithering, the painstaking application of color in checkerboard patterns to create the impression of a larger color space. His first tests were promising, but the alternating pixels played havoc with Zack's compression algorithm, so dithering had to be shelved. In a 2001-8 web interview, Mark wrote, and I quote, "When the Zack project was finished, I sat down one morning and rendered a twilight scene with a rising moon and stars over receding oak-covered hills, all rendered smoothly and subtly in EGA dithered gradients. Then, in silent protest, I simply left the picture up on my monitor and went to lunch. An hour later, I returned to find Ron Gilbert and Steve Arnold at my desk, enthusiastically debating why dither could not be compressed in code. Within 2 months, it could. And Loom was this technique's first result. In discussing the visual style of Loom with Gary and Mark, I discovered that we all shared a particular admiration for this film, Walt Disney's 1959 production of Sleeping Beauty. We liked the animation of Mark Davis, one of Walt Disney's 9 old men, and creator of the film's delightful villain, Maleficent. We liked the dreamy, twinkling style of visual effects animator Ub Iwerks, and most especially the distinctive art and color direction of Ivan Earle, a maverick perfectionist who pissed off the entire Disney production staff but made Sleeping Beauty look like no other Disney film before or since. This montage shows a few examples of how Sleeping Beauty informed and inspired the visual design of Loom. Two other artists also made substantial contributions to Loom. The first was Ken Macklin, a whimsical comic artist who created the original box art for Maniac Mansion. Ken was responsible for many of the visual effects in Loom: glows, twinkles, rippling water, moving clouds. Nowadays, this stuff would be dialed in with a particle system. Ken had to do it all by hand, 1 pixel at a time. I remember being introduced to Steve Purcell in Gary's office one day. Steve handed me an issue of one of his comic books. The cover showed a rabbit and a dog, heavily armed. I opened the issue to a random page and found a crew of pirates singing about their intimate relationships with manatees. Steve assisted Gary with the characters' designs and animation in Loom. His twisted mind was especially good with villains. Let me show you one of my favorite scenes from the game, featuring some of Steve's best work. So here Bobbin has come along to the Guild of Glassmakers and is greeted by the head of the guild here. The names of these guys are all kind of corny. So Bobbin is new at this, so tries to get in on the noble bit. So he doesn't remember having a weaver, and he mentions there's a legend, they say it is death, to peer beneath the hood of a weaver. So Bobbin is fairly evasive about this. So later in the game, this turns out to be interesting. Bobbin has been captured by the bad guy, who, of course, before killing Bobbin, has to tell him all about his scheme to rule the world. So now he has Bobbin's distaff, which he intends to use to do that with. He has this sphere which can tell the future, predicts he's about to be in control, and leaves him in the capable hands of Cobb. Cobb is interesting. We designed this really ugly character, and we didn't have a name for him, and we were looking at the picture which Purcell had drawn, and I said, what should we call this guy? And without any hesitation, he just said Cobb, just like that. And of course, it was perfect, so we left it in. So this is kind of fun here. Here we'll get a close look at Cobb. So both Cobb's character and this close-up you're about to see were Purcell. So he has lots of... let me tell you what. I'll look into the sphere if you let me look at something. What did you have in mind? So this is Purcell. Now notice he's really ugly, and when he blinks, the eyes are slightly out of sync to make him seem even stranger. He's really good at this. So I'll show you yours if you show me mine, kind of thing here. But Bobbin warns him he wouldn't do that if I were you, and Bobbin's very skillful here. If you fear nothing, then you'd better not touch me. Uh-oh. So if you played the game in expert mode, you saw a really cool cutscene of what happens next, but in this version, you don't see that. All you find out is there was a scream in the other room, and when the camera goes back, Cobb is mysteriously gone. So here we get another one of Purcell's characters. Mandible is about to cast the open spell on the graveyard, hoping to release the dead, who will, of course, bow to his every command. So we asked Purcell to create a villain for us. We also told him that we needed the villain to kill Bishop Mandible. And Steve asked me how he should do that, and I said, I'll leave that up to you. So I left. And the next day, I came into work, and everyone was standing in the office looking at me really strange, and Steve was sitting next to the monitor with this scene. And I said, well, did you come up with something? They said, yeah, we don't know if you're going to like it. I said, go ahead, show it to me. That's an Indiana Jones joke there. Show me what you got, Steve. So, greetings, noble spirit. I'm Bishop Mandible, transcendental apostle of the anti-secular conclave of clerics, who have I the honor of summoning. And this is the rending spell, and this is what Steve showed me that morning. So that's fairly mild by today's standards, but at the time, it was the wildest, craziest animation that had ever been seen in a computer game. I said, yeah, we'll leave it in. Visual style is not the only thing Loom has in common with Sleeping Beauty. Both were inspired and accompanied by the work of the same composer. I was a boy in junior high school when Tchaikovsky opened the door of orchestral music to me. His melodies, among the most beautiful in Western music, have been my constant companion through life, particularly the three ballets, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, and his first and greatest of all, Le Bernardero, Swan Lake, Opus 20. The complete score of Swan Lake has been recorded dozens of times. I own copies of every one of those recordings, together with every available DVD and Blu-ray. In fact, I listened to it complete on my way down here the other day. This ballet is basically the soundtrack of my life. And when I finally had a chance to put music in one of my games, there was never any question of where that music would come from. One of our contractors, a cool bearded guy from LA named Dave Warhol, was given the challenge of translating Tchaikovsky's score as faithfully as possible to the PC. Dave told me to send the score to a guy in Austin who he referred to as the Fat Man. This turned out to be George Sanger, actually a tall and lanky man, who provided this photograph of the actual score pages he received from me in 1989. It was George who transcribed 7 of Swan Lake's 29 sections into MIDI, using Ozawa's recording of the Boston Symphony as a tempo reference. His complete and faithful MIDI arrangement had to be mangled many times in order to accommodate the playback abilities of different home computers. Now, PCs in the late 1980s contained no audio hardware to speak of. There was just a tiny little speaker inside the case that you could beep at different frequencies to obtain crude music or sound effects. Luckily, many gamers were willing to invest $195 to get one of these. Adlib, the first mass-market sound card based on a Yamaha FM synthesizer chip. Players with $500 or $600 to burn could buy a Roland MT32, which offered more channels, better sound, and stereo. Lucasfilm offered an MT32 upgrade disc for Loom for $10. Now here is a comparison of how these options actually sounded. Here's the game as I developed it. 16-color EGA with Adlib FM audio. Same scene again. This time with 256 color art from a later version of the game and the MT32 stereo soundtrack. Those of you with sensitive hearing may wish to cover your ears now. Imagine the poor suckers who had to test that version. Loom was announced at the 1990 Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. This was the press kit, which included an invitation to a magic show by Lance Burton and a compact disc edition of the Loom audio drama. Only 1,000 of those discs were pressed. They are now highly collectible. And there's my original exhibitor's badge up front, also highly collectible. 3 months later, on the afternoon of Thursday, the 6th of March, I handed 6 5.5-inch floppy disks to my producer, Greg Hammond, and went home to bed. That Friday night, Eric Wollmunder prepared these 4 discs containing the source code for the tools used to create and play the game: sputum, earwax, bile, and mucus. Thankfully, these are PC format discs and still completely readable. I had never worked so hard on anything in my entire life. They say I looked pretty awful towards the end. Well, at least it's over, I thought. It can't get any worse. Boy, was I wrong. Coming from Infocom, I was pretty spoiled when it came to packaging, but the Lucasfilm marketing team really outdid themselves with Loom. The overall design is by Rick Strand. If you've never had an actual specimen of this box in your hands, take my word for it, it is impressive. I was speechless with delight when they handed it to me. Mark Ferrari did the colored pencil magic for the front of the box. It captures the atmosphere and promise of the game very effectively. The back of the box was designed by Dugald Sturmer, a really talented guy who for some reason I never got to meet. Allow me a moment of pride here. There are, in fact, worse things that can happen to you than to have your name appear on a box beside that other name. Incidentally, the bullet points in the back of the box later became the script for the pirate in the Monkey Island scumbar. The audio drama came on a stereo cassette inside the box. The final mix, which is slightly different from the one on the promotional CD, clocked in at just under 30 minutes. A bit of technical trivia. Side 1 contained the entire program encoded with standard Dolby B noise reduction. Side 2 contained the same program encoded with Dolby S, their newest, best, and final noise reduction system for cassettes. Loom was the first commercial tape to use Dolby S. With good equipment, listening to that tape on S is nearly as good as the compact disc. Very, very impressive tech. Here's the inside cover of the Book of Patterns. We're still in the age of copy package-based copy protection here. The red gel lets you see the code you need to enter the start game. Inside the book are descriptions of the spells you can find in the game with places to write down the notes. Only about half of the spells in the book actually appear in the game. Part of the fun is figuring out which spell you had just found. Rick Strand did these woodcuts. Now, I got permission to do something with Loom that we'd never done, or actually we tried a little bit with Infocom, a limited signed edition of the game, given as a deluxe gift to key members of the press and friends of the company. Loom actually had 2 limited edition runs, a presentation edition of 25 numbered copies for the press, and an author's edition of another 25 copies for friends and people who had worked on the game. These 2 stamps were used to mark the inside of the boxes. This is copy number 1 of the author's edition, which I presented to my wife, a person I did not see very often during the production of this game. Very little of the art created for Loom went unused, but the glass makers always seemed to be a problem. I had big, big plans for these guys, but many of my ideas just didn't pan out. This is Mark's original design for their realm. Kind of looks like Six Flags Emerald City. But we couldn't figure out how to implement this in less than a dozen rooms, so we had to simplify it. This was a little time travel puzzle which involved using the emptying draft to annoy the guy trying to fill the hourglasses. This got dropped when we changed the design of the city. This stupid room drove me crazy. It was a hall of mirrors, one of those time-wasting mazes I should have known better than to put in the game. But it was really cool to look at, with multiple bobbins moving in opposite directions. Very nice. I finally got it working, but it turned out to be really easy to solve, so we dumped it. The source code and art for these missing scenes still exists, by the way. Loom was translated into several foreign languages, including French, German, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Japanese, and I think Korean. Here are the boxes of the German and Spanish editions. Unfortunately, the audio drama was only translated twice, into French and then into German. These are my test copies of those recordings. The packages in other languages did not come with a cassette. There's also this intriguing and very collectible Hebrew edition. It was arranged and paid for by a private Israeli businessman who really liked the game and wanted to make it available in his own country. I don't think there were more than 100 of these. Loom was one of the first American computer games to have its own soundtrack album. Some Japanese technicians showed up at the ranch one morning, hooked up some PCs to a mastering recorder, and captured the music from Maniac, Zack, Indian the Last Crusade, and Loom. A few months later, we got 2 discs, one containing music from all the other games, and this one devoted entirely to Loom. Now, I had to turn on the contrast on this photo so your eyes wouldn't bleed. The music on the disc is equally striking. Instead of using George's transcription, which is credited in the package, they decided to write their own special arrangements, taking considerable liberties with the melodies and harmonizations of Mr. Tchaikovsky. There's also some confusion about the ordering of the songs. For example, the overture appears on track 4. Anyway, another Japanese company, Fujitsu, asked us to create a 256-color CD version of Loom for their FM Towns PC, a machine apparently intended to appeal to bodybuilders. Anyway, here's the original EGA version of Loom versus the Towns. Now here, the extra colors actually work against the design of the game. In this first scene, the leaf was deliberately the only red thing on the screen in order to encourage the player to interact and touch it. In the Towns version, it doesn't stand out very well, so more colors is not always better. The Towns version also had some other oddities. Now, this scene shows Master Goodmold of the glassmakers lying in a pool of blood after being attacked by chaos. Apparently, Fujitsu decided that this scene was a little too gory, so they removed the blood from under his head in the room, but forgot to remove it from the much more visible icon on the screen. The American CD-ROM version finally got this right. Odd that they went to such trouble to remove that little pool of blood, but somehow failed to remove the horrific decapitation of Bishop Mandible. The CD-ROM version has a few other unauthorized oddities. In these scenes, Chaos appears to have undergone gender reassignment. And the proofreading was occasionally a bit lax in these foreign versions as well. So Loom was generally admired by the press. Everyone praised the music and the art and the story. They also politely noticed that Loom was easier and shorter than most games, but agreed that these qualities made it a very good choice for children and beginners who didn't read these magazines anyway. The game won several awards, however, including Macworld's Adventure Game of the Year and Best Interface Design at the very first GDC award ceremony in 1991. Lucasfilm did quite well that night. As I recall, the award for Best Game Design went to Ron Gilbert for The Secret of Monkey Island. Maybe I should have tried insult spell weaving. Anyway, while we're on the subject of Monkey Island, this scene got my name in the Smithsonian Institute with a TM on it, so thank you for that, Rod. Are you noticing a pattern here? So Monkey Island was not the only Lucasfilm games that got on Loom's case. Some unknown artist used a palette trick in this FM Towns close-up to conceal a little message for me. And Lucasfilm was not the only game company to get on Loom's case either. Dig that crazy music.
The latest bomb from master storyteller Moriarty, Boom, is a post-Holocaust adventure set in post-Holocaust America after the Holocaust. Neutron bombs have eradicated all life, leaving only you to wander through the wreckage. No other characters, no conflict, no puzzles, no chance of dying, and no interface make this the easiest to finish game yet. Just boot it up and watch it explode.
I forgave them because that was actually the voice of classic cartoon voiceover artist Gary Owens delivering that. That's actually really Gary Owens' Space Ghost. I was so flattered. I came across this message on Tumblr, which I find curiously pleasing. So only a few companies bothered to take potshots at Loom. And one company seems to have discovered some value in it after all.
At the moment, I don't do animation at all.
Brian Moriarty and Hal Barwood look like average enough guys, but they're from a different world. Oh, they may walk and talk here with the rest of us, but they work, play, and live more than a little in this one.
When people play games, board games included, and computer games, you don't really think about the person behind it.
Ron Gilbert is another one of those people, along with Moriarty and Barwood, who create computer adventure games, story games. They make up only 1% of the very lucrative electronic games market, but it's quite a 1%.
It's the small part, but it's the interesting part. It's the part where the interesting stuff that's going to appear on the Nintendos of the future appears here first.
So a number of people, probably children or beginners, seem to have liked Loom very much. Over the years, I've accumulated a couple of boxes filled with fan letters, fanfic, and manga, like this one from Switzerland. This thing is like 50 pages long. A shout out here to John Christensen, who created an entire series of prints based on classic adventure games, including this one from Loom. I really ought to buy a copy of this someday. One group of very serious European fans spent 5 years working on a sequel to Loom. They published the first chapter last year. Let me show you just a bit of that.
My name is Rusty Nailbender. the Guild of Blacksmiths, son and heir of the foreman, and I formally request your aid under the conclave doctrine, as permitted in a state of emergency.
What under earth are you talking about, lad?
Tell me quickly, please, where's your graveyard?
We miners do not bury our dead in the ground.
She means we cremate.
What? Are you telling me you're not dead?
Not at all. Not yet, maybe.
By the forge.
I would have thought I'd have more time.
Where do you think I'm going?
To claim our new arsenal. 10,000 new blades to slaughter those who oppose chaos.
When I first found this photo, I couldn't figure out what they were. Salt and pepper shakers, maybe? Later, I learned that they're pieces from a custom chessboard populated by characters from Lucasfilm games. Very nice. This little reminder arrived in my mailbox a few years ago. Probably should have worn it here. So let me just play the finale of the game here while I riff a bit. So here at the end, poor Hetchel has been turned into a roast duck. Bobbin undoes that trick. And Hetchel is telling off chaos here. And this is where Bobbin learns the rending spell, which chaos used on the bishop and now applies to poor Hetchel. And all that's left of her is this black feather. And if you touch it, there's your sequel promise. So now Bobbin is really pissed off, but having just learned the spell from Chaos, he applies it to the loom itself, thereby rending the fabric of reality. And the return of his mother, the Swan. So this sequence you're about to see was very carefully choreographed so it could fit entirely on one floppy. Remember, people did not have hard drives. The disc had to be swapped out of the floppies for each scene. So a great deal of work went into fitting all the music and all the art for the scene into one floppy so that it could be played continuously as a finale, as you see here. So here, here Bobbin gets earns the final note on the distaff, and Chaos tries a little trick and misses. And now he can cast the final spell, Transcendence, on himself. So for this scene, I asked Ken Macklin, I said, I need the swans to take the fabric of the universe and pull it away across the sky. Right. Here's what he came up with. So now we have a reprise of all the final scenes. Again, cut versions of this so all the characters could appear without any disc swapping. So if I have a regret about Loom, it's that I did not pursue the sequels, The Forge and The Fold. On the stage at GDC, I identified 3 studios I would entrust with making those sequels: Telltale, Double Fine, and Wadjet Eye. I publicly invited these studios to talk to me. Within minutes of getting off the stage, I was in discussions with representatives from 2 of them. I should have included Harmonix in that list, but it wasn't necessary. Their founder, Alex Rogopoulos, invited me to repeat this lecture at his studio a few weeks later. After giving this lecture at GDC, a long line formed at the side of the stage. Dozens of men and women who wanted to tell me that they had played Loom as a child and that it had inspired them to find a way into the game industry and make games themselves. I get email like that practically every week from strangers all over the world. It's a humbling experience to have touched so many people. Imagine being handed the absolute freedom to experiment with George Lucas's fortune. It was a privilege I can never repay, and probably will never repeat. Thank you very much.
Bueno, como les comenté, si tienen preguntas, por favor, hagan fila acá y siéntanse libres de preguntar lo que deseen a Brian.
Any topic is legal.
Tienen que tener preguntas, vamos, anímense, así que... Sí, pero a la fila. Vos sos el ejemplo, a la fila, como corresponde, que vos lo pediste el año pasado.
Hey. So my first question is, if you had to change something in the game, like going back to it, if you had to change something in the story or the game itself, what would that be?
When I played it for the first time in almost 25 years, about a month before GDC, just to look at it again and familiarize myself, and it was better than I remembered, actually. But there are a few bits of dialogue that go on a bit too long. And there are a couple of spells and things that we had to remove for space reasons that I would like to put back. Other than that, other than regrets about not having better sound and better images, I'm fairly happy with it. It's not perfect, but unlike the artist statement you saw earlier, it actually doesn't suck.
Thank you.
So the obligatory question is, how did talks went with those studios?
So, interesting question. How do they go? So, how much can I say here? All right, I think I can tell you some of it. So, as you know, Double Fine Games, which is run by Tim Schafer, one of the Lucasfilm veteran designers, has already released a remastered version of Grim Fandango, and is about to release a remastered version of Day of the Tentacle, which includes inside it Maniac Mansion. They did this by, I believe, buying options to the rights to several Lucas adventure games. Now, those of you not familiar, optioning is a kind of a Hollywood term. It means you go to a company and you buy the option to make something, say a film of a book or a licensed game or something, for a certain period of time. And as long as you start the production inside that window, the rights are yours. But when the option ends, if you have not started production on the thing, you lose the rights and it reverts back to the original publisher. So my understanding is that they optioned several Lucasfilm adventure game titles, including Loom, but did not start working on it until after the option had expired. They still want to do it, but now when they go to Lucas asking for the options, they are told that someone else has purchased them. We don't know who or for how long. And no one's talked to me. So it's kind of in limbo.
Hi. I remember watching the first talk on San Francisco when you mentioned that the discs were lost, and so the original design files were lost. And now I hear you saying that you got it back. Is it possible for to put those online, that we could get a look at it?
So I, of course, disavow any ownership of any copyrighted Lucasfilm materials. But even if I did have anything like that in my possession, I would certainly not be legally entitled to release it to anyone. Understand?
Yeah.
Sorry to fall in the cliché question, but which are some of your favorite games?
My favorite games from that period or from all time?
All time.
Rogue is one of my favorite games of all time. The original, not some of the incredibly bombastically increased. The original Rogue is of a very nice scale. I really like it. I really liked Ultima 4. I thought it was a really good game. I have great admiration for The Secret of Monkey Island. It's very cleverly written, very, very nice. But my current favorite game is something that hasn't come out yet by a friend of mine, Jonathan Blow. It's called The Witness.
Thank you very much.
So one thing about The Witness, just a little friendly warning. If you're interested in playing this game, stop reading about it. Don't look at any pictures, don't watch any videos or trailers, don't read any reviews. Do nothing but buy it, sit down and play it alone. And be prepared to have your mind bent. Yes?
I'm asking this since you work in the Dig game. It's known that the hardest puzzle of all time is in that game is known as the skeleton puzzle. Do you know what I'm talking about? Skeleton puzzle in the Dig game.
The skeleton puzzle? That was considered really hard?
Yeah, that is almost impossible. It's famous for that reason.
Okay.
You think that
is it still
that was a mistake or a good decision?
So the Dig, yes, the Dig. This is a topic I usually refrain from talking about. So here's some trivia. Did you know that the Dig is actually the best seller of all of the Lucasfilm adventure games? Far selling Monkey Island and Grim Fandango, it was actually the best seller. A very successful game. And the fact that they were able to pull it off in 5 years, which was a long time in those days because of all the rewrites, and pull it off so successfully is actually a great tribute to the skills and ability of the people who did it, particularly Sean Clark, the project leader. I have a lot of respect for that guy for taking what I abandoned and turning it into something commercially quite successful. The Dig did have some relatively hard puzzles in it, but so the game as published has kind of a grab bag of stuff from my design. Some of my design survives in it, but some does not. Particularly the puzzle structure, the overall meaning of the puzzles kind of got lost after I left. I don't remember whether that puzzle was the same as I designed it or not. I haven't played the Dig since it came out in '95, so I don't really remember it very well. But the game had kind of a meta game going on in it that had to do with mathematics and physics, and that's kind of hard to talk about without showing. And of course, I don't have anything from the Dig at all that I can show, because that would be wrong. I can tell you that the game had a very different ending. And Augustine, would you like to say something at this point?
Yes. Primero, vamos a cortar el live stream ahora, entonces. Les pedimos por favor que no filmen, no tomen fotos. Somos una comunidad muy chica y si alguien muestra, posteando en YouTube lo que va a mostrar Brian ahora, como les había adelantado Andrés, en serio, es algo que no vio nadie nunca, jamás.
No es un tema de buena onda, es un tema legal.
Es un tema legal, muy bien. And,